this is Dawn from the Carnegie Library, and I'm picking up where we left off on our wonderful story, An Elk Dropped In, and this is by Andreas Steinhoffel. Sorry, Mr. Andreas, if I pronounced your last name incorrectly, but here we are with An Elk Dropped In. And the chapter we're beginning is chapter 6, Mr. Moose Flies Off. Okay. Next morning, we heard the awful news on the radio. It was announced that an old man in a check suit singing at the top of his voice had been picked up by the police. The old man was obviously mentally disturbed, as he had maintained that he was Father Christmas. For this reason, he had been admitted to a psychiatric institution. "What's a psychiatric institution?" I asked. "A lunatic asylum," said Mama. "The loony bin," said Grandma. "It's a mental clinic," Kiki explained to Mr. Moose, who was listening attentively in the garage. "And once you're in there, you don't get out again that easily." "So what?" I said. "What's so bad about that?" I wasn't that taken with Santa Claus. He hadn't behaved very well towards us. He'd come to take Mr. Moose. He'd given away all our secrets. He might even have turned us all into burnt biscuits. It seemed only right to me that he was tucked away in the loony bin now. "But little boy," shouted Mr. Moose, "tomorrow night is Christmas Eve. If the boss stays locked away, there'll be no Christmas." I understood right away what he meant by that. If there was no Christmas, everybody's heartfelt desires wouldn't be fulfilled anywhere in the world. "That's really terrible," I whispered. A fully automatic electric juicer like the one hidden under my bed wasn't a heartfelt desire. A heartfelt desire is for peace on earth, that the man and the woman from Casablanca end up together, making everyone happy. "If only I were allowed to fly," said Mr. Moose, "I'd crash through the roof of that clinic, snatch the boss, and beat it." He shook his head worriedly, and the tassel under his chin swung sadly from side to side. The situation seemed hopeless. We were really desperate. Mama hit on the idea of driving over to the clinic. As she didn't have a car of her own, Gertrude Weatherspoon drove her all the way to the other end of town in her little black Mini. An hour later, they were back without having achieved anything. "They wanted to lock me away," shouted Mama furiously. "Well, you really shouldn't have ordered the doctor to let Father Christmas go immediately," said Gertrude. "That was really stupid of you, Kirsten Wagner." When Kiki and I told Mr. Moose what had happened, he began to cry. Enormous tears rolled down from his beautiful eyes to his dark fur. "It's all my fault," he said unhappily. "I should never have crash landed. I'm a disgrace to the family of the Servadae." He backed into the farthest corner of the garage, where he curled himself up into a dark ball. I offered him green and red jelly bears and tickled him behind his drooping ears, but nothing and no one could comfort Mr. Moose. By the afternoon, we still didn't know how we could set Santa Claus free. Mama was in the kitchen cooking a bowl of poached pears in order to cheer Mr. Moose up. Kiki and I were in the sitting room with Grandma, who needed a little drink of cherry brandy because of all the excitement. "Poor Father Christmas," she sighed, "and I meant to give this back to him. It must have fallen out of his pocket." She held something out for us to see. It was a tiny brown cloth bag. Milky Way powder. "Oh, keep it to remind me of him," said Grandma. "That doesn't belong to Father Christmas. It's mine," said Kiki. She can tell a lie without batting an eyelid. Mama maintains she'll go far in this world. "If it belongs to you," said Grandma, glaring, "then you must know what's inside it." "Of course I do," replied Kiki sweetly. "It's got dry giraffe poo from the zoo in it." Grandma screamed and dropped the little cloth bag in horror. 10 seconds later, Kiki and I were in the garage with Mr. Moose. "Yes, it really is Milky Way powder," he said after he peeped into the little bag. "Now I can fly to the clinic and set the boss free." "You'll have to take us with you, Mr. Moose," I said. "You won't find your way without us." "Right you are," said Mr. Moose. "But quick, we haven't a moment to lose. Sprinkle the Milky Way powder over me, little boy." "How?" Just imagine the little bag is a pepper pot and Mr. Moose a steak, said Kiki. Well, I don't think so, grunted Mr. Moose, offended. I shook the Milky Way powder over his fur. The pale little grains did actually look like pepper. It was only when you looked at them closely that you could see they sparkled just a little bit. Mr. Moose went down on his knees so that Kiki and I could climb on his back. Off we go, he said. But we didn't, because standing outside on the snow-covered drive was old Peneki. His fur cap had slipped far down onto his forehead, making him look very funny. But what didn't look funny at all was the shotgun he was holding in his hands. Nativity play indeed, he shouted. You've been hiding that elk. I spotted his footprints in the wood. Mr. Peneki, sir, please let us pass, I called. Otherwise, there's not going to be any Christmas. Old Peneki just laughed. He positioned the shotgun and aimed at Mr. Moose. I was terrified. But just like Kiki sitting behind me, I didn't move. If we remained sitting on Mr. Moose, Peneki might not shoot. Get down, he growled. I want some elk antlers, and these will do nicely. The best you'll get is a pair on your silly hat, muttered Mr. Moose. Peneki had never heard an elk speak before. His eyes opened wide, and he lowered the gun. Then he stood motionless as if he'd turned to stone. Gawk, he said. Gawk, replied Mr. Moose. What's a gawk? He thinks he's one of his own chickens, said Kiki. And here is a picture of them sprinkling the dust upon Mr. Moose. Remember, the dust looked like pepper, but just a little bit of a sparkle if you look closer. Turn the page here. And now the children are aboard Mr. Moose, and there's old man Peneki. Later, she explained to me that old Peneki had gone into shock. That was why he didn't move, even as Mr. Moose scraped his hooves sharply on the ground several times and then shot past him on the ground beyond the drive. Hold on tight, mumbled Mr. Moose, and a moment later he rose up from the ground and the wind was rushing past our ears. I had a feeling in my stomach like I got when Papa used to play airplanes with me and whirled me into the air. We're flying, I yelled. Don't look down, called Mr. Moose, or else you'll get dizzy. But I did look down. Our shadows slid over Mama, who was coming out of the house with a bowl of poached pears. She looked up and saw us flying off. Then Mr. Moose changed direction, and Mama disappeared. There is nothing to compare with flying on Mr. Moose's back. It was like our ride through the winter woods, but this time we were flying. The cold wind brought tears to my eyes, but I couldn't stop looking around. The town below us looked really, really tiny. The houses and the cars were like the pieces of a tiny toy village. And here's what he saw. The whole town below them. I recognized the school and the railroad station. I saw the ice rink with the people gliding across it like tiny colored dots. Look, yelled Kiki. She was pointing ahead. In the far distance, behind the snow-covered rolling hills, the sun was sinking like a flaming ball. Its light sent magical red outlines around the fluffy clouds. The whole world, the hills and the trees, the rivers and the lakes, everything was suddenly covered with a rosy shimmer. Oh, Mr. Moose, I called and felt so happy. Yes, he murmured. I know, little boy. We hadn't been flying long when it began to snow and my ears were feeling very cold. I was glad that soon after that we spotted the clinic. It stood on a hill at the edge of the forest. Its little battlements, tall gabled roof, and 4 chimneys made it look like a castle. Sounds pretty cool. Here it is. Looked a lot like a castle. You'll have to put us down somewhere before you crash through the roof, Mr. Moose, called Kiki. But we didn't have to get down, and Mr. Moose didn't have to drop through the roof. That wasn't necessary because Santa Claus was sitting on the roof between 2 chimneys. Down in the courtyard of the clinic, Men and women doctors in white coats were running about and pointing up at him in great agitation. "Hello!" called Santa Claus, waving at us. Mr. Moose turned an elegant curve as he swooped down right toward the roof. Right next to Santa Claus, he stopped in midair, just as if he had firm ground underneath his hooves. "Kindly get on, boss," he puffed as some snowflakes danced in front of his nostrils. "My faithful Moose!" yelled Santa Claus. His check suit and rosy old face were covered in soot. He clambered up awkwardly onto Mr. Moose's back and sat down behind Kiki and me. It was a bit of a squash because he was so fat. I noticed that Santa Claus smelled like a chimney sweep. "I skedaddled up the chimney in the doctor's office," he explained. "After all, climbing chimneys is my specialty." "Well done, Mr. Boss," mumbled Mr. Moose. He did an almost vertical takeoff over the rooftop, snorted briefly, and sped away. "Ho, ho, ho!" shouted Santa Claus in delight. And then we swept through the sky in the snowdrifts on the back of faithful Mr. Moose, who, as far as I'm concerned, is the greatest hero in the world. That's the end of chapter 6. Thank you.